Previous videos have shown you how to describe sounds in more scientific ways. But it's also helpful to practice describing them in more poetic ways because sometimes that's more relevant to the musical composition as a whole. When we describe a sound's overall character, we call that its timbre, borrowed from French, not timber like part of a tree used for construction. Timbre can incorporate many aspects, so it's most easy to say that when two sounds have the same pitch and same loudness, their timbre is what makes them different. Sometimes people use words like tone or tone quality instead, but other times the word tone is used interchangeably with note and sound, so timbre is the most clear term to use. How might you describe a sound's timbre? You can say it's high or low in pitch, or loud or quiet, but there's more to a sound than that. Looking at a sound in a time domain view, you can see how the amplitude changes over time. The general shape of a parameter changing over time is called an envelope, and the way a sound's loudness changes over time is called its amplitude envelope. Without sound, there's just silence, so a sound starts by rising from silence, often to its loudest point. This part of an amplitude envelope gets called the... Do you know it already? It starts with the letter A. It's called the attack. Not because it has to be violent, but because French theorists wrote the book on this during the Enlightenment. They chose that word and everybody still uses it. A lot of things are that way. More neutrally, you could call it the onset, but attack is still used the most often. The attack often begins with a burst of energy because that's what most musical instruments need in order to start vibrating, like striking a metal bar. That burst of energy doesn't usually last long, and so the attack is often followed by a brief period when the amplitude falls to a more sustainable loudness. This gets called the... Have you heard it before? After the A word comes a D word. It's called the decay. Most traditional music relies on tunes, contiguous strings of pitches for its structure, and you need to hold a note out for a while so we can hear its pitch. After the attack and decay comes the part of many sounds that can be stretched out for varying lengths of time. This is called the... Do you remember hearing these letters before? The A and the D, and the next is the S for sustain. And after you've sustained the note as long as you want, it's time for the A, D, S, R for release. This is the end of a note, but it really describes the portion of a sound when it's ending as it falls to silence. That usually doesn't happen instantly, so the release describes the whole ending portion of a sound, like when you release a piano key. That pushes a felt damper up against the strings to absorb its vibrations gradually until they fall silent. This is the stereotypical amplitude envelope. And these basic parts are often all a synthesizer will give you, often simply labeled ADSR. However, not every sound is exactly like that. It might have more or fewer parts, or parts that deserve thinking up other labels. But back to timbre, we can describe a sound in terms of its amplitude envelope, like if it has a fast or slow attack, or fast or slow release, or if it's sustained at all. But you might also describe a sound's timbre in terms of its spectral content. Even looking at a sound's waveform in the time domain, you can guess whether a sound is going to have much high or low frequency content by considering whether it has many sharp points or blunt curves. In the frequency domain, these correspond to treble and bass partials. Previously, we discussed a sound's spectrum having its partials arranged in a harmonic series, or having many inharmonic partials. But you're more likely to begin describing a musical sound in terms of being pitched or unpitched, maybe quasi-pitched, with a mix of harmonic and inharmonic partials. Or maybe mostly pitched, with just some inharmonic partials, or mostly noisy. Here, noise doesn't mean just any sound that's not usually considered to be musical, but instead something having many inharmonic partials, usually a contiguous band of frequencies. Besides thinking of individual partials or their frequency relationships, you might also describe a sound by its spectral envelope, the general shape, from low to high frequency. A sound with a lot of treble partials might sound bright, strident, or nasal. A sound without a lot of treble content might be muddy, or mellow. A sound with only treble and no bass content might sound tinny, brittle. A sound with a lot of bass content might sound full or heavy. You can also describe a sound by comparing it to the sounds of familiar materials or techniques. The Hornbostel-Sachs system classifies musical instruments by their materials and their modes of excitation. Similarly, we might describe timbres as sounding wooden, which usually suggests that it's quasi-pitched but mostly noisy, not very bright or bassy, and hollow with a fast attack and fast release, not usually sustained. Or something might sound more metallic, suggesting it's brighter, with more distinct inharmonic partials and usually sustained. Sometimes it's helpful to imagine a physical action that could make a sound, like hitting, stroking, dragging, blowing, or shaking. However, be sure to stick to describing a sound rather than declaring how it was made, unless you're certain. For example, a sound might seem electronically synthesized, but unless you're certain, call it synthetic sounding instead of saying it was synthesized.